The Seoul night was a tapestry of electric neon and deep shadow, a view Joon-Ho Kim knew too well. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city pulsed silently below, a circuit board of endless ambition. Here in the quiet eye of the storm he reigned. Kim Innovations was his brainchild, an empire of sleek design and ruthless efficiency, and he was its most instrument. At 34, his genius was undisputed, his wealth astronomical, and his solitude absolute. His world was one of code, strategy, and silent, shimmering isolation. He scrolled through another financial report, the glow of the monitor etching sharp lines onto his impassive face. The building had emptied hours ago, a deliberate choice. He preferred the company of his own thoughts, the hum of the servers, the clean, predictable lines of his uncluttered desk. His personal assistant, Min-jun, had learned long ago to leave a dossier of next-day items and vanish before 8. It was a sound that broke the ritual. Not the whir of the HVAC or the distant chime of an elevator, but a voice. Warm, resonant, and cutting through the sterile silence with a clarity that made him pause his scrolling. He stood, his chair soundless on the plush carpet, and moved toward his office door, left slightly ajar. The voice came from the Bloom conference room down the hall, a space named by a branding team for ideas that were supposed to flourish. Few ever did. Respectfully, the data is being interpreted through a singular cultural lens. The voice was speaking English, fluid and confident. The launch timeline assumes a unified consumer response across all target regions. It's efficient, but it's not accurate. Joon-Ho drifted closer, a shadow in the dim hallway. The conference room's glass wall was frosted but not opaque. He could see the silhouettes of 4 people on the large monitor, a video call with the Toronto satellite office. The speaker was a silhouette centered on the screen. Amara, the head office, approved this framework, a weary male voice countered. Amara. The name hung in the air. The head office approved a framework that will yield 70% effectiveness. The voice, Amara, replied, not with challenge but with collaborative energy. We have the chance, right now, to build the strategy that hits 95. We do that by segmenting not just by age or income, but by digital cultural habits. The social media landscape in Lagos is fundamentally different from Seoul, which is different from Sao Paulo. Our campaign needs to speak in 3 distinct dialects, not one translated 3 times. Joon-Ho found himself leaning slightly. Her argument was not just correct, it was elegantly constructed. She was dismantling a mediocre plan not with criticism, but by building a superior one in real time, brick by logical brick. It's more work for the creative team, another voice sighed. It's better work, Amara responded, her tone softening into encouragement. And it's work that will actually resonate. Let me draft the regional differentials. I'll take the lead on the extra hours. We can present a comparative model. Show them the growth they're leaving on the table. There was a pause. Joon-Ho could imagine the team on the other end, worn down by the hour but being stirred by her conviction. Okay, Amara. Let's see your draft. The resignation was gone, replaced by reluctant interest. Perfect. Thank you, team. Get some rest. I'll have something by morning our time. The call ended. The light from the conference room screen died, leaving only the ambient emergency lighting. Joon-Ho heard the soft shuffle of papers, the click of a laptop bag. He should have returned to his office, a ghost unseen. But he remained. The door opened and she stepped out. Amara J. He'd seen her file, strategic planning manager, seconded from Toronto for a year, top marks from her department head. The file hadn't captured the essence of her. She was taller than he'd imagined, her posture regal even in clear fatigue. Her hair was gathered in an intricate series of soft twists that cascaded down her back. She wore a simple, elegant blazer over a vibrant, patterned top, a splash of color in the monochrome corridor. She was looking at her phone, a small, tired smile on her face, perhaps texting someone that she was finally heading home. As she passed his doorway, she glanced up, sensing his presence. Her eyes, even in the low light, were bright and intelligent. She started slightly, not expecting anyone. Oh, Mr. Kim. Good evening. She offered a polite, professional nod, her voice now carrying a formal cordiality, different from the passionate collaborator of minutes before. Good evening, he replied, his own voice low and measured. Working late. Just finishing up, she said, her smile polite but now guarded. The energy she'd exuded in that room was carefully sheathed in the presence of the CEO. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion. Safe journey home. Thank you, sir. Good night. She continued down the hall, her footsteps fading toward the elevator bank. Joon-Ho stood in his doorway long after the chimes signaled her departure. The silence of the floor returned, but it felt different. It felt charged. The ghost of her argument, cultural lens, distinct dialects, resonance, echoed in the space she'd vacated. He returned to his desk, but the financial reports held no meaning now. Instead, he opened the internal portal and navigated to the Project Atlas file, the launch she had been discussing. He read the official strategy, the one he'd skimmed and approved. Then he imagined her version, the one that aimed for 95%. For the first time in a long time, Joon-Ho Kim felt a flicker of something beyond the binary of profit and loss. It was curiosity. It was the faint, unsettling, and intriguing sense that a new variable, brilliant and unexpected, had just been introduced into his perfectly ordered equation. He closed the portal, the city's neon glow reflecting in his dark eyes. Tomorrow, he decided, he would observe this variable more closely. The morning sun streamed into Joon-Ho's office with an accusatory brightness. The ghost of the previous night, a warm voice in the dark, a silhouette against a screen, had not dissipated with the dawn. It had solidified into a decision. He instructed Min-Jun, his assistant, with uncharacteristic specificity. He wanted the Project Atlas team, specifically the Toronto contingent liaison, to present their revised strategic model directly to him at 2 p.m. He offered no further explanation. Min-Jun's slight pause before acknowledging the instruction was the only sign of its irregularity. Joon-Ho never sat in on mid-level strategy deep dives. His day was a fortress, its gates opened only for final approvals and catastrophic fires. The hours until the meeting passed with a strange, attenuated quality. Joon-Ho attended his scheduled meetings, his responses as precise as ever, but a part of his consciousness felt reserved, held in waiting. He found himself reviewing Amara Ajay's personnel file again, not the dry bullet points of her accomplishments, but the narrative they suggested. A first-generation Ghanaian Canadian, a degree in global communications, a swift, merit-based rise. A builder of bridges. At 1:58 p.m., he entered the Bloom conference room. His presence caused a visible ripple. The 4 team members from the Seoul office, including the lead project manager, Mr. Park, stiffened, their expressions shifting from pre-meeting ease to acute alertness. On the large monitor, the 3 Toronto team members looked similarly startled. And there at the Seoul table was Amara. She stood as he entered, a gesture of respect mirrored by the others. Today she wore a dress of deep emerald green, its simple lines highlighting her poise. The vibrant pattern of the night before was gone, replaced by a subdued elegance, but she still brought a vital warmth to the cool, gray room. "Please be seated," Joon-Ho said, taking the chair at the head of the table. "Proceed with your presentation." Mr. Park began, his voice slightly tighter than usual. He outlined the original, approved launch plan, its logic clean, its projections safe. Joon-Ho listened, his face an impassive mask. His gaze, however, kept drifting to Amara. She was listening with intense focus, her notebook open, a pen held lightly in her hand. She was not just waiting for her turn. She was actively engaging with Park's words, her head tilting slightly in thought. "And now," Park said, a hint of reluctance in his voice, "Ms. Ajay has prepared an alternative comparative model, focusing on regional differentials." Amara nodded, her demeanor shifting from listener to conductor. "Thank you, Mr. Park. If I may." Her voice was clear, devoid of theatricality, but filled with a quiet authority that pulled the room's energy toward her. She stood and moved to the presentation screen. What followed was not a rebuttal, but a revelation. With crisp slides and clean data, she deconstructed the monolithic global consumer into 3 vibrant, distinct cohorts. She spoke of digital high-touch communities in West Africa, where mobile interaction was deeply social and narrative-driven. She contrasted it with the curated consumption patterns of East Asia and the brand-as-advocacy mindset of key Western markets. Joon-Ho listened utterly still. Her intelligence was undeniable, but it was her method that captivated him. She wasn't just analyzing markets, she was interpreting cultures. She spoke of respect and engagement, of translation versus transcreation. Her suggestions were not just creative, they were deeply strategic, revealing blind spots in his own company's thinking, blind spots he now realized were there. By implementing this tiered approach, she concluded, her pointer resting on a final slide showing a significant jump in projected market share and brand affinity, we move from a broad-stroke campaign hoping for acceptance to a targeted dialogue designed for adoption. The initial resource allocation increases by approximately 15%, But the ROI, as you can see, potentially increases by 70%. Silence filled the room. The Seoul team looked nervously from Amara to Joon-Ho. The Toronto team on screen held their breath. Joon-Ho leaned forward, his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers. His eyes were fixed on Amara. She met his gaze, not defiantly but with a steady readiness. He saw no arrogance there, only a firm belief in her work. The media buy would be fragmented under your model, he stated, his first interruption. Segmented, sir, not fragmented, she corrected gently, without a trace of insolence. The core brand message remains unified, innovation for connection. But the vehicle for that message adapts. It's a symphony, not a single repeated note. The cost per targeted engagement actually decreases. He asked another question, then another, probing for weakness. Each time her response was immediate, data-backed, and insightful. She anticipated his concerns about production timelines, internal bandwidth, risk mitigation. She had built not just a pitch but a full operational plan. The debate, for that is what it became, lasted 20 minutes. The other attendees became spectators to a duel of intellects. But it wasn't hostile, it was generative. With each exchange, Joon-Ho felt a part of his own mind, long dormant in its solitary supremacy, waking up. It was challenging, it was exhilarating. Finally he sat back. The room seemed to exhale collectively. The original plan is adequate, he said, his voice flat. Mr. Park's shoulders slumped slightly in resigned understanding. Then Joon-Ho continued. Adequate is the enemy of Kim innovations. We do not pursue adequacy. He looked directly at Amara. Implement Ms. Ajay's model. Mr. Park, you will provide full support. Report progress directly to Minjun weekly. A stunned silence, then a chorus of yes, sir. Amara's reaction was a subtle, slow blink, followed by a profound, respectful nod. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Kim. We will not disappoint. He gave a single nod in return and stood to leave. As he passed behind her chair, he caught the faintest scent, something warm and subtle like sandalwood and citrus. He also saw, up close, the small, detailed drawings in the margin of her notebook. A tiny, elegant geometric pattern next to her notes on demographic data. A mind both rigorously analytical and instinctively artistic. Back in the silence of his office, the fortress felt different. The walls seemed less like a barrier and more like a vessel, waiting to be filled with a new kind of energy. He had not just approved a project. He had, for the first time in years, been genuinely intellectually engaged. And at the center of that engagement was not an abstract idea, but a person. A woman whose mind was a landscape he found himself inexplicably drawn to map. The variable had a name, a face, and a formidable intelligence. And Joon-Ho Kim, the master of control, was no longer in control of his own curiosity. A new, almost imperceptible rhythm entered the cadence of Joon-Ho's days. The approval of Amara's Project Atlas strategy was a closed business matter, yet it remained an open channel in his mind. He found his thoughts returning to the logic of her arguments, the graceful certainty of her gestures in the conference room. It was an intellectual fascination, he told himself. A commendation of exceptional talent within his company. Yet, his actions began to trace the outline of something more personal, something he lacked the vocabulary to name. He started to notice her, not in the fleeting way one notices any employee, but with a focused, quiet attention. His office, his sanctum, became an observation post. His desk faced not the door but the windowed wall overlooking the city. A carefully positioned, slim decorative mirror on a shelving unit, however, offered a reflected sliver of the open-plan workspace outside his open door, a concession to awareness he'd never before needed. It was in this sliver that Amara's desk resided. He learned her patterns. She arrived precisely at 8:45, never rushing, often exchanging a warm greeting with the elderly cleaning staff who were still finishing their rounds. A simple "Good morning, Mr. Choi," that seemed to genuinely brighten the man's day. Joon-Ho, who knew every employee's name and productivity metrics, realized he did not know the cleaner's name. The observation felt like a small, private rebuke. She worked with a concentrated calm, often so absorbed that she would absently twist a single lock of hair around her finger as she stared at her monitor. But it was her departures that held a peculiar magnetism for him. She was rarely the first to leave but often among the last. When the floor quieted, she didn't immediately pack up. Instead, she would spend 5 minutes tending to a small, vibrant ZZ plant on her desk, wiping its leaves with a cloth, checking the soil. It was a ritual of care, a tiny pocket of nurturing in the sterile environment. He found himself waiting for it, the day's final administrative task before he allowed himself to stand from his own desk. Her project updates, forwarded by Min-jun, were masterpieces of clarity. They were also subtly transformative. She had re-energized the entire team. Mr. Park, once merely competent, now submitted reports with flashes of genuine insight. The entire Bloom project group seemed to operate with a renewed collaborative spirit he could sense even through dry email chains. The credit, he knew, stemmed from her leadership, inclusive, respectful but uncompromising in its standards. It was this knowledge that birthed an impulse in him, foreign and unsettling. The team had just overcome a significant technical hurdle. A standard corporate congratulation, a generic email from the CEO's office, felt insufficient. It felt disconnected from the specific energy she had created. The desire to acknowledge it specifically, to connect the praise to its source, took root. He spent a late evening not on mergers but on research. He combed through global food delivery sites, reviews of Toronto's diverse eateries, and finally focused forums on West African cuisine. He learned about Kelawil, about Chinchinga. He wanted something authentic, something that spoke of her, not of the company pantry. He finally settled on a curated selection of high-quality Ghanaian snacks from a specialized online retailer: spiced plantain chips, peanut brittle, bottled hibiscus tea. The next morning he called Min-jun in. The Atlas team met their sprint goal. Send them a congratulatory package. Something distinctive. Not the usual. He slid a printed order confirmation across the desk. Min-jun picked it up, his eyebrows lifting a millimeter before his professional mask resettled. Of course, sir. A thoughtful choice. It is a recognition of their unique effort, Joon-Ho said, the explanation feeling both necessary and hollow. 2 days later, from his reflective sliver, he watched the delivery arrive. A box was placed on the common table in Amara's team area. Curiosity drew the group. Mr. Park opened it, pulled out the packs of snacks and read the label. He looked up, puzzled, then called Amara over. Joon-Ho watched her approach. She looked at the contents and her entire demeanor shifted. Her hand flew to her mouth, not in shock, but in what seemed like profound, disbelieving delight. She picked up a pack of the plantain chips, her fingers tracing the lettering. He saw her say something to the team, her face animated with a smile so bright it was visible even in the distant reflection. She laughed, a sound he could not hear but could see in the shake of her shoulders and the way her team leaned in, sharing her joy. She then looked around, her gaze sweeping the floor, as if searching for the origin of this unexpected gift. For a heart-stopping second, her eyes seemed to pass over the reflective glass on his wall. Joon-Ho froze, feeling inexplicably exposed. She couldn't see him, he knew that. But in that moment he felt seen. She gathered the team, distributing the snacks, saying something that made them all raise a bottle of the tea in a mock toast. The atmosphere was transformed, warm, connected, personal. It was a 10-minute party, and he was its unseen architect. The warmth that bloomed in his own chest was acute and confusing. It was the satisfaction of a precise intervention yielding predicted results. Yet it was more. It was the sight of her joy, a joy he had indirectly caused. It was a connection forged across the silent space of the office, a message sent and received without a single word being spoken between them. That evening, as he prepared to leave, he noticed her at her desk later than usual. She was alone, finishing a note. Instead of tending to her plant, she was looking at the empty snack package, a soft, contemplative smile on her face. Then, deliberately, she took the label and tucked it into the corner of her desk blotter, a small keepsake. Joon-Ho turned from the mirror, the city's lights blurring before him. His world, built on explicit directives and measurable outcomes, had been subtly invaded by the power of implication, of gesture. He had sought to acknowledge her impact, and in doing so, had irrevocably acknowledged his own preoccupation. The variable was no longer just a professional asset. She was a person whose happiness had become a quiet, personal interest. The realization was as terrifying as it was compelling. The crisis arrived not with a shout, but with a series of tense, terse emails flagged in red. Kim Innovations' proposed partnership with Ubuntu Tech Collective, a pioneering consortium of startups based in Accra, Lagos, and Nairobi, was crumbling. Weeks of negotiations, conducted through formal channels and interpreted through a rigid corporate lens, had hit a wall of profound misunderstanding. The draft agreement was a legal masterpiece that had somehow managed to insult their prospective partners' core philosophy of communal growth and reciprocal respect. Joon-Ho read the latest pointed reply from UTC's lead negotiator, his usual composure fraying at the edges. The deal was strategically vital, a gateway to the continent's most dynamic tech ecosystem. But more than that, its failure would be a stark, public testament to a lack of vision, the very flaw Amara had implicitly highlighted in her first presentation. The irony was bitter. Minjun stood before his desk, awaiting instructions. "Shall I have legal draft a more forceful revision of the liability clauses, sir?" "No," Joon-Ho said, the word cutting through the stale air. Force was the problem. He swiveled his chair to face the city, but he wasn't seeing the skyline. He was seeing a warm, confident smile over a package of plantain chips. He was hearing a voice explain transcreation over translation. He turned back. "Schedule a new negotiation session. For 2 days from now. Our team will be myself, Director Choi from Legal, and—" He paused, the unorthodox nature of his decision hanging in the silence. "And Amara J. from Strategic Planning." Minjun's pen hovered over his tablet. "Ms. Ajay, sir? She is not on the business development team, nor is she a lawyer. She is a cultural strategist," Joon-Ho stated, as if the title had just been invented and bestowed upon her. "This is no longer a purely legal or financial negotiation. It is a cultural one. Her title will be Senior Cultural Liaison Advisor for this session. See to it." The summons, when it reached Amara, was met with a mixture of professional excitement and acute anxiety. She appeared at his office doorway precisely at the appointed time, her posture perfect, a notebook in hand. "You requested me, Mr. Kim? Come in. Close the door." She did, standing before his desk. He gestured for her to sit. "You are aware of the Ubuntu Tech Collective impasse. I've seen the high-level updates, sir." "Your assessment?" She took a breath, choosing her words with care. "We are trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, sir. We're negotiating a partnership like a merger, emphasizing protections and exit clauses. UTC's public ethos is all about rising together. Our current approach reads as, succeed alone or sue." Her blunt accuracy was bracing. "Precisely. You are added to the negotiation team. Your role is to bridge that gap. To interpret not just the words but the spirit behind them. To advise on tone, gesture, and unspoken expectation." Amara's eyes widened slightly. The weight of the responsibility, and the extraordinary trust it implied, settled on her. "I understand. I will prepare thoroughly." And prepare she did. The dossier she sent him the next evening was not a rehash of financials. It was a concise, brilliant primer on the concept of Ubuntu itself. I am because we are. It analyzed the personal backgrounds of the 3 UTC principals, their previous collaborations, the symbolic importance of communal decision-making. It included notes on conversational etiquette, topics to avoid, and themes that resonated with shared ambition during the negotiation itself. Held in the formal summit conference room, Amara was a study in quiet power. She did not speak often, but when she did, it recalibrated the entire conversation. Director Choi would make a legal point, which would cause a slight frown from the UTC lead, a formidable woman named Naledi. Joon-Ho would glance at Amara. With a barely perceptible nod, she would intervene, not challenging Choi but reframing. "What Director Choi is articulating aligns with the shared responsibility model you championed in your Lagos incubator project," she might say, her voice calm and respectful. Or, "If we viewed this not as a liability carve-out, but as a mutual stewardship commitment, could the language reflect that?" She caught subtle cues they all missed, a slight stiffening at a particular term, a warming at the mention of long-term legacy. During a break, Joon-Ho watched as Amara and Naledi stood by the refreshment table. Amara pointed to the pattern on Naledi's dress and mentioned the symbolism of a similar Adinkra symbol, Gainayam. Naledi's face lit with surprised delight. The conversation flowed into art, family, and the weight of building something for the next generation. It wasn't schmoozing, it was genuine human connection. By the end of the second day, the agreement was transformed. The language was warmer, more relational, built on frameworks of mutual success. The handshakes that followed were not perfunctory, but hearty and filled with genuine respect. Naledi hugged Amara before leaving. "You have a sister's mind," she said warmly. "You help them see us." After the room emptied, only Joon-Ho and Amara remained, surrounded by the detritus of water glasses and notepads. The silence was thick with spent energy and accomplishment. "You performed exceptionally," he said, the formal words inadequate for what he felt. "It was a team effort," she replied, but her eyes were bright with the thrill of a challenge met. "It was not." He took a few steps closer, reducing the vast space between them. "Your intervention was the catalyst. You translated more than words. You translated intent. He hesitated, the fortress walls within him trembling. I would like to understand. How did you learn to do that? She looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time not as her CEO, but as the man who had asked her a personal question. She smiled, a little weary but open. Dinner table lessons mostly. My father moved here, to Canada, for opportunities, but he carried Ghana with him. My mother is a professor of diaspora studies. Every conversation was about navigating spaces, honoring the root while understanding the branch. It's just listening for the music behind the words. The music, he repeated softly, captivated by the phrase. Yes, you heard it today. It wasn't just about clauses. It was about trust. The music was about building something that lasts. He nodded slowly. My father, he found himself saying, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, spoke only of building something that endures. The music, I think, was often sacrificed for the structure. It was a confession he had never made aloud. Amara's expression softened into one of deep understanding. Sometimes the most enduring structures, she said gently, are the ones that make space for the music. In that moment, surrounded by the echoing silence of the boardroom, Joon-Ho felt a connection more profound than any business deal. It was a meeting of histories, of philosophies, across a chasm of different experiences. He saw not just a brilliant employee, but a woman of profound depth and empathy. And she, perhaps, saw not just an imposing CEO, but a man whose solitude was not entirely of his own choosing. A soft, genuine laugh escaped him, surprising them both. It was barely more than an exhale, but it was real. Thank you, Amara, he said, her name feeling both foreign and right in his mouth. Thank you for the opportunity, Joon-Ho, she replied, and the deliberate use of his given name in this private, earned space felt like the final, perfect note of the day's new music. The company retreat was an annual obligation Joon-Ho traditionally endured like a mild, protracted illness. This year, held at a meticulously restored Hanok village in the serene countryside outside Seoul, promised the usual bland cocktail of forced camaraderie and vapid synergy-building exercises. He attended out of duty, a silent, watchful figure in expertly tailored casual wear, moving through the activities like a ghost. Amara, by contrast, was a natural. He watched her throughout the day from a distance, a strange, quiet magnet pulling his attention. She tried her hand at traditional pottery, laughing without self-consciousness when her vase collapsed. She listened with rapt attention to the master craftsman explaining the symbolism in the wooden rafters. She was present, fully and vibrantly, a splash of warm color against the rustic backdrop. Her ease was a stark contrast to his own perpetual state of internal exile, even amidst a crowd. The late afternoon brought a sudden, dramatic shift. A warm, heavy stillness descended, followed by a sky that darkened to the color of a bruise. The first fat drops of rain exploded on the ancient clay-tiled roofs just as the group was dispersing for free time. A frantic scramble ensued as employees dashed for the cover of the main hall or their assigned guest houses. Joon-Ho, who had lingered on a covered walkway to answer a pressing email, found himself momentarily disoriented by the sudden exodus. When he looked up, the central courtyard was a sheet of hammering rain, obscuring the paths. He decided to make for the pavilion of listening, a small, isolated structure on a hillock he'd noted earlier for its solitude, assuming it would be empty. He was wrong. As he slid the wooden door open, shaking the rain from his jacket, he found Amara already inside, standing by the open lattice window watching the storm. She turned, her expression one of shared surprise. Mr. Kim, she said, straightening slightly. It seems we had the same refuge in mind, he replied, his voice sounding unusually loud in the small, quiet space. The pavilion was just big enough for a low wooden table and silk floor cushions. The drumming of the rain on the roof was a cocooning, intimate sound. It's beautiful in its way, she said, gesturing to the view of the mist-shrouded mountains now visible between veils of water. A bit dramatic for a team-building retreat, though. A faint smile touched his lips. Indeed. An awkward silence descended, filled only by the rain. They were CEO and employee, alone in a secluded space. Every professional protocol screamed for him to make an excuse and brave the storm. He did not move. Would you care for tea? He heard himself ask, noticing a simple brass kettle and a canister of leaves on a side shelf, left for guests. It seems we may be here for a while. She looked momentarily startled, then nodded. That would be nice. Thank you. The simple, ritualistic act of boiling water, warming the pot, and steeping the leaves gave his hands a purpose. He served her with a formal care that felt both instinctive and profoundly out of place. They settled on opposite cushions, the low table between them, steam from their cups mingling in the cool, damp air. The conversation began with safe topics: the success of the UTC deal, the progress of Project Atlas. But the storm outside, the cozy dimness of the pavilion, and the strange suspension of normal hierarchy worked a subtle alchemy. The talk drifted as naturally as the mist into personal waters. He learned she missed the fierce, chaotic love of her big family's Sunday dinners in Toronto. She learned he had been a prodigy, pushed into engineering and business, his childhood a parade of tutors and expectations where a vintage guitar in the corner of his room had been his only rebellion. "You play?" she asked, her eyes lighting with genuine interest. "I did. Baroque lute mainly. It's mathematically beautiful. Precise." He hadn't touched it in years. "I love music too," she said. "Though my family's taste runs more to high life and hip life. It's all rhythm and story. My father would say your lute music and my Uncle Kofi's guitar playing are just different dialects of the same language. Speaking to the heart." "Different dialects," he murmured, remembering her words from their first meeting. The symmetry was poignant. The rain lessened to a gentle patter. A shared quiet fell, but it was no longer awkward. It was comfortable, a blanket woven from fragments of unveiled selves. In this vulnerability, the careful wall he maintained around his deepest feelings developed a critical crack. He looked at her, her face soft in the diffused light, a curl escaped from her twist and resting against her cheek. She was looking out at the clearing sky, a peaceful expression on her face. He felt a surge of something so potent it stole his breath. Not just attraction but a profound gratitude for her existence in his sterile world, a dizzying sense of recognition. The words were out before he could vet them, spoken in a low, raw voice he barely recognized as his own. "My days have become brighter since you arrived here." The silence that followed was absolute. The rain had stopped. Amara's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes wide, searching his face for context, for a professional subtext. She found none. What she saw was naked, unguarded sincerity. A slow, deep blush spread across her cheeks. Her lips parted slightly but no sound came out. She looked overwhelmed, not with displeasure, but with the sheer, unexpected weight of the confession. It was not a proposition. It was a truth, simply stated, and it hung between them as tangible as the steam from their tea. He immediately regretted it, terror clamping his heart. He had shattered the delicate balance, imposed a personal truth on a professional relationship. He opened his mouth to retract, to clarify, but the words died. He would not cheapen it with a take-back. Amara finally looked down at her hands, clenched tightly around her now cold cup. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper, threaded with confusion and something else, a fragile wonder. Joon-Ho. The use of his name was his undoing. It acknowledged the shift, the man-to-woman precipice they now stood upon. Outside, a bird began to sing, the world refreshed and clean. Inside the pavilion, the air was thick with a terrifying, beautiful possibility. He had not planned to say it. He would never know what might have happened next, for at that precise moment, the distant sound of voices calling their names, Minjun's, Mr. Park's, cut through the stillness, searching for their missing CEO and colleague. The spell shattered. Amara stood up quickly, smoothing her dress. "They're looking for us," she said, her voice regaining a veneer of normalcy, though her eyes were still stormy. Joon-Ho rose, his CEO mask slamming back into place, though it felt like a poor fit. "Yes. We should go." They walked back down the slick path toward the gathering group, side by side, but the careful foot of space between them now felt like a canyon. He had spoken his truth into the quiet, and the quiet had answered with a profound, echoing silence that promised nothing and everything all at once. The polished silence of Joon-Ho's office on Monday morning was a lie. The serene order of his desk, the predictable view, the hushed efficiency of the floor outside, all of it was a stage set, behind which a silent, frantic rehearsal was taking place. The memory of the rain-soaked pavilion, the steam from the teacup, and the words he had released into the air played on a relentless loop in his mind. "My days have become brighter." It had been a seismic confession, and now he was navigating the aftershocks with the grace of a man walking on shattered glass. His terror was not of rejection, but of imposition. He had burdened her. He, with all the power in their dynamic, had introduced a personal vulnerability that she, as his employee, was now forced to manage. The thought filled him with a cold self-reproach. His only path forward, he decided with grim resolve, was absolute, impeccable professionalism. He would rebuild the wall, brick by precise brick, and give her the safety of its shadow. For Amara, The return to headquarters was a journey into a baffling emotional labyrinth. The memory of his voice, stripped of all CEO authority, filled with a raw sincerity that had vibrated in her very bones, was at war with every instinct of self-preservation. The man in the pavilion had been someone entirely new. But the man who now occupied the CEO's office was a stranger of a different kind. Her first interaction set the tone. She needed a final signature on the UTC implementation documents. Entering his office, she found him standing by the window, his back to her, a silhouette of pure, unapproachable focus. "Mr. Kim? The Ubuntu files for your approval." He turned slowly. His face was a mask of polished neutrality. "Leave them with Minjun. He will process them." His voice was flat, distant. The warmth, even the challenging intellect from their debates, was gone. It was as if the pavilion conversation had been a shared hallucination. "Of course," she said, her own voice carefully neutral. She placed the folder on the edge of his desk and retreated, the unspoken words between them hanging heavier than any document. The days that followed were a masterclass in polite estrangement. In meetings, his eyes would slide over her as if she were another piece of furniture. His feedback on her work, once direct and engaging, was now delivered through Minjun or in terse, flawless emails that contained no hint of the collaborative partner she had known. He had withdrawn into the highest tower of his authority, and the drawbridge was firmly up. Amara misinterpreted the fortress for a prison of regret. His formality felt like a correction, a silent retraction of his words. She convinced herself she had misunderstood, or worse, that he now saw her as a complication to be managed, a problem employee who had inspired an unprofessional moment. The bright connection she had felt, the meeting of minds, the shared laughter over music, was now recast in the harsh light of potential career suicide. She doubled down on her work, her own demeanor becoming flawlessly, distantly professional. She was brilliant, efficient, and utterly unreachable. The tragedy was the depth of their mutual misunderstanding. Each was trying to protect the other. Joon-Ho, believing he was shielding her from the pressure of his position and his own unchecked feelings, was only making her feel invisible and chastised. Amara, believing she was respecting his clear desire for distance by becoming the perfect, impersonal employee, was only convincing him that his confession had irrevocably damaged their easy rapport. The project suffered for it. Not in quality, the work was still exceptional, but in atmosphere. The Bloom team felt the new frost. The innovative energy that had characterized their sessions dampened. Ideas were presented safely, not passionately. Amara, once the catalyst, now simply executed flawlessly, offering no extra insight, sparking no unexpected debates. She was preserving herself. Joon-Ho watched this diminishment from his reflective sliver with a quiet agony. He saw the cautious set of her shoulders, the way she no longer lingered after meetings. He saw her brilliant light being deliberately dimmed, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he was the cause. His attempt to give her space was instead creating a vacuum, sucking the very vitality from her that he so admired. The climax came in a weekly strategy meeting. Amara presented a market analysis. It was, like everything she did, technically perfect. But it was also sterile. She stuck rigidly to the data, offered no interpretive leaps, no connections to the cultural music she once heard. When Mr. Park asked a tangential question, she deferred to existing policy instead of exploring the novel opportunity it presented. Joon-Ho listened, a cold stone of disappointment settling in his gut. This was his doing. He had taken a vibrant, strategic mind and made it fearful. He had traded the bright days for this gray, efficient silence. After the meeting, as the room emptied, he spoke without looking up from the table. "Ms. Ajay." A moment. She froze, then slowly retook her seat. The others filed out, the door clicking shut with finality. He finally looked at her. The professional mask was still in place, but his eyes, for the first time in weeks, held a trace of the man from the pavilion, troubled, sincere. "Your analysis was adequate," he began, his voice low. She nodded, bracing for criticism. "It was also," he continued, the words costing him, "devoid of the insight you uniquely possess. You presented what was expected, not what was possible." Her professional composure flickered. A flash of hurt, then defiance, crossed her features. "I was adhering to the project parameters and avoiding unnecessary speculation." The unspoken word hung in the air, complication. He understood then the full extent of her misinterpretation. She thought he wanted her to be less. The realization was a blow. "Unnecessary speculation," he repeated softly, has been the source of this company's greatest successes. Do not censor your mind on my account. It was as close to an apology, as close to a plea, as he could muster within the walls he himself had reinforced. She met his gaze, her own confusion and frustration laid bare for a second before she carefully banked it. Understood, sir. Is that all? He gave a single, stiff nod. That is all. She left, and he was alone with the ruins of his own strategy. The wall he'd built to protect her had become a prison for them both, and the silence within it was deafening. It began with a single anomalous alert on a server dashboard at 3:17 a.m. By 6 a.m. it was a cascading failure. Project Atlas wasn't just stalled, its core infrastructure, the global user authentication and data synchronization protocols, was imploding. A latent bug in a recent security update, triggered by an unforeseen combination of regional traffic spikes, was corrupting data packets. It was a silent, digital hemorrhage. Panic, for Joon-Ho, was not an emotion but a calculus. By the time he strode onto the main operations floor, a place usually humming with orderly productivity, it was a war room in controlled chaos. Screens flashed red. Voices were tight-clipped. The team leads looked haggard, having been roused from sleep. And there, at the epicenter of one cluster of monitors, was Amara. She was still in the casual clothes she'd evidently thrown on. Dark jeans, a simple sweater, her hair pulled into a loose, practical bun. There was no trace of the cautious, restrained employee from the past weeks. Her entire being was focused on the cascade of error logs, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She was speaking rapidly to two senior engineers, her fingers flying over a keyboard to pull up diagnostic reports. It's not the load balancers, she stated, her voice cutting through the background noise with clarity. The failure is sequential and follows the path of the updated encryption module. We need to isolate the module's interaction with the legacy Asian servers first. That's the patient zero zone. Joon-Ho absorbed this, immediately issuing commands to redirect efforts. He did not reclaim center stage. He integrated himself into the effort she was already leading. For 36 hours, the world narrowed to the glow of monitors, the bitter taste of cold coffee, and the shared, grinding focus of a dozen people fighting a common enemy. He watched her. He watched as she translated complex technical jargon for the strategic team, ensuring business decisions were informed. He watched her fetch water and energy bars for the younger engineers flagging at dawn. He watched her mediate a heated dispute between two architects with a calm. The system doesn't care about whose code it is. It cares about what works. Show me the merge conflict. She was a leader, not by title, but by innate capability and profound empathy. She held the human element together as fiercely as she fought the technical one. Near the end of the second day, a patch was holding. The digital bleeding had stopped. Stabilization was seeping into the system. The collective tension in the room began to dissolve into a wave of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. People slumped in their chairs, rubbing bleary eyes. Amara was finishing a final communication to the regional heads, assuring them of the fix. As she hit send, she pushed back from her desk and stood up. The movement was too fast. The lack of sleep, the adrenaline crash, the sheer physical toll, it all converged. She swayed, her hand shooting out to grasp the edge of her cubicle partition, her eyes squeezing shut. Joon-Ho saw it from across the room. He was moving before he had formed a thought. In 3 long strides he was beside her. His hand came up and settled firmly, steadyingly on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of ownership or intimacy. It was an instinct of pure human support. The touch was solid, warm and grounded. Her eyes flew open meeting his. In them he saw no alarm, no discomfort, just a dazed acknowledgement of her own limit. She leaned into the pressure of his hand for a single vital second, allowing it to bear a fraction of her weight. It was an acceptance of care. The professional boundary, the wall of weeks, meant nothing in this raw human moment of shared trial. You need to rest, he said, his voice low and rough with his own fatigue. The team can monitor. She started to protest, but he shook his head, the decision made. I will take you home. Sir, that's not. It is, he said with a finality that brooked no argument. It was not a CEO's command but a protector's decree. The work is done. Now we recover. The drive through the neon-washed, post-midnight Seoul was silent. The kind of silence that follows a storm, empty of tension, filled only with weariness. She gave him her address, then leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed. He drove with a focused calm, the luxury car gliding through the nearly empty streets. At the entrance to her apartment building, she turned to him. The guardedness was gone, burned away by exhaustion and the residual glow of hard-won victory. "Thank you, Joon-Ho. For everything tonight. For driving me." He nodded. It was a team effort. A small, tired smile touched her lips. It was. She hesitated, then, driven by the same unguarded impulse that had made her sway, she stepped forward. Her arms came up and wrapped around him in a brief, tight hug. It was not romantic. It was profound. It was the hug of comrades in arms, of two people who had stood back to back in the breach and survived. It was an exchange of gratitude, of respect, of shared humanity. He felt the solid reality of her, the weight of her exhaustion, the strength in her frame. His own arms came around her, holding her just as firmly for just as long, a mere handful of heartbeats. Then she released him, stepping back, her eyes now clear and softly luminous in the dim foyer light. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night, Amara," he echoed. He waited until she disappeared inside the elevator before returning to his car. Sitting in the driver's seat, the ghost of her embrace still imprinted on him, he felt the final brick of the wall he had built crumble to dust. No formal strategy, no careful distance, could withstand the truth of that moment. He had touched her and she had leaned in. He had driven her home and she had hugged him in thanks. The connection was no longer an abstract fascination or a dangerous confession. It was real. It was a fact as solid as the ground beneath them, forged in the crucible of crisis and cooled in an act of simple human comfort. The path forward was still uncharted, but the barrier was gone. The clarity that settled over Joon-Ho in the days following the crisis was of a different kind. It was not the sharp, algorithmic clarity of business logic, but the quiet, resonant clarity of a decision made in one's soul. The touch, the hug, they had been instinctual, born of exhaustion and relief. Now, in the calm light of day, he understood they were also a doorway. He could not and would not step back through it to the sterile land of professional pretense. But to step forward required a precision more delicate than any contract negotiation. It required an intention as clear as crystal, leaving her with absolute agency. He waited for a Friday, a day with a natural boundary. He had Min-Jun clear his afternoon, a rarity. Then, at precisely 1 p.m., he appeared at the entrance to her workspace. She was absorbed in her monitor, but her posture was different now, softer, less rigidly defensive than in the previous weeks. The shared trial had reset something fundamental. "Amara," he said, her name spoken with a calm that drew her gaze immediately. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course." She began to rise, likely expecting a work directive. "In my office, please." She followed, a hint of wariness returning to her eyes. Once inside, he did not retreat behind his monolithic desk. Instead, he gestured to the small seating area by the window, 2 armchairs and a low table, a space he had never used for a one-on-one meeting. A subtle but significant shift in terrain. He waited for her to sit before taking the chair opposite, ensuring no desk, no symbol of his authority, was between them. He leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, his dark eyes meeting hers with a directness that was earnest, not imposing. "I have asked you here on a personal matter," he began, his voice low and even. "This is not a conversation between a CEO and an employee. It is a conversation between Joon-Ho and Amara. Do you agree to speak on those terms?" She was clearly taken aback, but after a beat, she nodded. "I agree." He took a steadying breath, the most vulnerable action he'd ever performed in this room. "The words I spoke in the pavilion were true. They were also unfair. I placed a personal feeling into a professional dynamic where you had no equal power to respond. For the pressure that created, I am deeply sorry." Amara's lips parted in surprise. An apology was the last thing she'd expected. "My subsequent behavior," he continued, "my distance, was a failed attempt to rectify that error. I thought to give you space to remove any perceived obligation. I see now I only created confusion and a diminishment of your brilliant spirit within these walls. That is a loss I cannot bear." He paused, ensuring each word landed with its full weight. "So, I am here to state my intention with complete transparency. My admiration for you began with your mind, with your character as I witnessed it here. It has grown into a deep affection I can no longer and do not wish to suppress. I would like the opportunity, with your consent, to explore the possibility of a connection between us, outside of these offices." He saw the shock bloom in her eyes, followed by a flicker of profound emotion. But before she could speak, he held up a hand gently. "There are conditions. Non-negotiable ones. First, this has no bearing on your employment. Your role, your projects, your trajectory are yours alone. I will sign any document you wish, placing your position under the irrevocable stewardship of the board, immune to any influence from me. Second, if you are uncomfortable, I will arrange an immediate, advantageous transfer for you to any of our other global offices, with a significant promotion and my fullest recommendation. Your career will not only be secure, it will be enhanced. Third, if you choose to explore this with me, we will disclose the nature of our relationship to human resources on Monday, establishing clear, mutual protocols to ensure no conflict exists. He leaned back, his entire being focused on her. The choice is entirely, exclusively yours. You may say no, and we will work together professionally with my utmost respect forever intact. You may say yes, and we begin slowly with discretion, on a foundation of absolute equality. But you must choose freely. That is the only thing that matters to me. The silence that followed was vast, but it was not the fraught silence of the previous weeks. It was a space being filled with the enormity of his offer. He was not leveraging his power. He was systematically dismantling its relevance to this decision. He was offering her not just his affection, but his vulnerability, his integrity, and a guaranteed safe exit. Amara looked down at her hands, then out the window at the endless sky. When she looked back, her eyes were bright, a little wet, but utterly clear. The transfer, she said, her voice soft. The promotion. You would do that even if I said no. Without hesitation, he answered immediately. Your happiness and your professional fulfillment are separate from my personal hopes. They must be. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. She wiped it away, a slow smile beginning to break through, a sunrise of an expression. All those conditions, they're because you don't want me to ever feel trapped. Yes. She took a deep, shaking breath. Then, I don't need the transfer. And I don't need a document from the board. She met his gaze, her own now filled with a matching courage. But I would like to have dinner. Just Joon-Ho and Amara. I think talking to HR on Monday is the right thing to do. A relief so profound it felt like oxygen flooded his system. He did not reach for her hand. He did not move. He simply let the shared truth settle between them in the sunlight. That would mean everything to me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Their first dinner that Saturday was at a quiet, traditional Hanjeongseok restaurant in an alleyway far from the corporate districts. The conversation was not about mergers or market differentials. It was about childhood fears, his, disappointing his father, hers, being the new girl in a cold classroom, about favorite books, about the guilty pleasure of terrible reality TV. They laughed, freely and often. The intimacy was in the sharing, in the discovery. The physical expression, as they agreed, was restrained but tender. It was found in the safe, deliberate moments. His hand hovering at the small of her back as he guided her through a door, the way her shoulder would lean against his arm as they walked through a night market, the hello and goodbye hugs that lasted a second longer each time, becoming a silent language of their own. They were building trust, molecule by molecule, in the space between words and the certainty of respectful touch. He was learning the music of her, not as a strategist but as a woman. And she was learning the man behind the billionaire, note by gentle, unwavering note. Their world became a delicate, beautiful dichotomy. By day, within the gleaming towers of Kim Innovations, they were models of reformed professionalism. The tension that had once been a wall of ice was now a bridge of warm, mutual understanding. In meetings, their eye contact held a new depth, a silent shorthand of shared humor or unspoken support. He no longer avoided her gaze. He met it, and within that millisecond connection was a universe of private understanding. She, in turn, presented her ideas with her old passionate clarity, no longer censored, her brilliance shining once more, now fueled by a quiet, personal joy. But the true texture of their connection was woven in the spaces between. Their relationship, as promised to HR and to each other, was built on a foundation of profound discretion and slow, intentional discovery. It existed in the golden hour after work, in secluded parks, and in the quiet corners of museums. It was a shared secret, not out of shame, but out of a mutual desire to protect the fragile, growing thing between them from the distorting lens of office gossip and external pressure. Their dates were lessons in quiet intimacy. He took her to a private viewing of a classical Gaiageum performance, the intricate, mathematical beauty of the music resonating with his soul. Afterward, over tea, she explained how the plucked strings reminded her of the kora from her father's homeland, drawing a line between his world and hers. She introduced him to a tucked-away Ethiopian restaurant in 81, and as they shared injera from the same platter, her fingers brushing his as they reached for the same spicy stew, the act felt more intimate than any formal kiss could have been. The physical boundary they maintained became its own language of reverence. The intimacy was in the permitted, the safe, the profoundly caring. It was Joon-Ho, noticing her shiver slightly in a breezy evening garden, silently removing his tailored coat and draping it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment to ensure it was settled. The weight of the fine wool, still warm from his body, felt like an embrace she carried with her. It was Amara, after he'd endured a particularly grueling international conference call, wordlessly stepping into his personal space as they stood in the privacy of his apartment entryway. She would wrap her arms around him, her head resting against his chest, and just hold him. No advice, no solutions, just the solid, unwavering comfort of her presence, her heartbeat a steady rhythm against his. He would rest his chin on the crown of her head, breathe in the scent of her, and feel the coiled tension of the day unravel. These hugs were their sanctuary, conveying more than words ever could. I see your weariness. You are not alone. I am here. They spoke of past heartbreaks in hushed tones. He confessed his only prior relationship had been a strategic merger of families, devoid of passion, ending in a quiet, mutual dissolution. She shared a story of a university love that had faded under the weight of different life paths. These confessions were not comparative, but connective, stitching their individual histories into a shared narrative of waiting for something real. One rainy Sunday afternoon, curled on opposite ends of his spacious sofa with books, the silence between them was so comfortably deep it felt like a third presence. She looked up from her novel. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what your father would think? Of this? Of me?" He closed his own book, considering the ghost of the stern, ambitious man who had built the first foundation of his empire. He would see the strategic advantage of a brilliant partner, Joon-Ho said honestly. Then a slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a sight that still made her heart skip. "But I hope, perhaps wrongly, that he might also have seen how you make the empire matter less, and the man within it matter more." Her answering smile was everything. It was acceptance and a love so deep it momentarily stole his breath. The secrecy, however, was not without its quiet strains. There were times she had to decline a team dinner, knowing he was waiting for her at a quiet jazz bar. Times he had to watch from across a crowded company function as others vied for her attention, his hands clasped tightly behind his back to keep from reaching for her. The longing to publicly claim their connection, to let his hand rest openly on the small of her back, was a constant, low hum. But they had made a pact. This time was sacred. It was for them alone to build something unshakable before introducing it to the scrutiny of the world. Their trust grew in this incubator of chosen privacy. He learned the cadence of her laughter when she was truly relaxed. She learned the subtle softening around his eyes that meant he was deeply content. They were building a shared history, one composed of whispered jokes, held hands under restaurant tables, and the silent, profound communion of those wordless hugs that spoke of shelter and home. It was a chapter written in gentle strokes, a slow, deliberate waltz where every step was savored. They were no longer billionaire and employee, nor merely a man and a woman tentatively exploring an attraction. They were Joon-Ho and Amara, architects of a private universe, laying brick by careful brick the foundation for a forever they were only just beginning to dare name. The storm did not come from the outside world, but from within the gilded walls of the empire itself. Board member Kwon, a man whose ambition was matched only by his resentment of Joon-Ho's modernizing influence, had been watching. He had seen the lingering glances, noted the CEO's unprecedented advocacy for the Bloom project, and witnessed the new, unshakable confidence in Amara Ajay. He mistook a profound connection for exploitable weakness. The boardroom was a cold arena of polished wood and judgmental silence. It was a quarterly review, but Kwon had requested additional time under matters of corporate governance. Joon-Ho, sensing the shift in the air, had quietly texted Amara one word: "Summit." No. He sat at the head of the table, a picture of impassive control. Amara entered, taking her usual seat further down, her posture composed but her eyes alert. She had not been summoned, but her presence was a calculated part of Kwon's play. Kwon began with feigned concern, praising Amara's work before his tone sharpened into a blade. Such exceptional results from a relatively junior staffer are, of course, commendable. But they do raise questions about the nature of the oversight. There have been observations. A degree of familiarity that breaches professional decorum. The significant, unilateral allocation of resources to her projects. It creates a perception, Chairman Kim, of undue influence. Of favoritism that could be construed as a quid pro quo. The accusation hung, toxic and explicit. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Amara felt a cold fury rise in her throat, not for herself, but for the ugliness now staining what they had so carefully protected. Joon-Ho did not look at her. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Kwon with a terrifying calm. "Are you alleging a breach of company policy, board member Kwon? I am suggesting an investigation is warranted to clear the air. For the sake of the company's reputation, and the morale of other employees who play by the rules." Kwon's smile was thin. Perhaps Ms. Ajay should be placed on administrative leave pending its outcome. It was the expected power play: isolate, intimidate, force a resignation. Joon-Ho stood. The movement was fluid, commanding every molecule of attention in the room. "An excellent suggestion. Clarity is paramount." He finally turned his gaze to Amara. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide open, filled with a respect and a certainty that took her breath away. "Ms. Ajay, do you consent to have our personal relationship discussed in this forum to resolve this matter?" A ripple of shock went through the board. Amara, her heart hammering against her ribs, held his gaze and gave one clear, firm nod. "I do." Joon-Ho addressed the room, his voice resonant and devoid of defensiveness. "What board member Kwon perceives as a vulnerability is, in fact, this company's greatest recent fortune." He is correct. There is a personal relationship. It began after the Ubuntu deal was signed, after the Project Atlas strategy was approved and demonstrating unprecedented success. Success you have all celebrated and profited from. Ms. Ajay's worth was established by her own merit, long before my personal regard for her deepened. He paused, letting the timeline settle as irrefutable fact. "We have been fully transparent with human resources since its inception. There is no breach. There is only a choice I made and one she made as consenting adults. To imply otherwise insults her integrity and mine." Kwon spluttered. "The conflict of interest remains." Her position, Joon-Ho interjected, his voice cutting like diamond, "is about to be irrelevant to this company's hierarchy." He turned back to Amara and for the first time, his voice softened into a tone the board had never heard. "Because I am stepping down as CEO of Kim Innovations." A collective gasp filled the room. Amara's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He continued, addressing the board but speaking to her. "The board will appoint a successor. I will remain as majority shareholder and chairman, but my operational role ends today." He then turned fully to Amara, his proposal laid bare before them all. "For the past year my focus has been pulled toward a new venture. A cultural tech incubator designed to be a true bridge between Korean innovation and West African entrepreneurial genius. An equal partnership, based on the principles of Ubuntu that one person in this room understands better than any of us." He walked to her side of the table, not as CEO to employee but as partner to partner. "This venture exists on paper. It is fully funded, independently of Kim Innovations. It needs a leader of vision, of cultural fluency, and unimpeachable integrity. I am offering you, Amara Ajay, the position of founding CEO. The offer is yours to accept or refuse, wholly separate from me, from this company, and from us. The decision is yours alone." The room was utterly still. The move was so vast, so definitive, it left no room for petty accusations. He had not just defended her. He had redefined the entire board. He had removed every possible shadow of doubt, every shred of power imbalance, by dismantling his own operational power and offering her a kingdom of her own. Amara looked from his earnest, open face to the stunned board, then back to him. She saw the future in his eyes, not a hidden agenda, but a shared horizon. He was choosing her, publicly, unambiguously, and on terms that made her his equal in every way that mattered. She stood, her own power radiating. She did not look at the board. She looked only at Joon-Ho. "The project is vital," she said, her voice clear and strong in the silent room. "And I believe in its mission. I accept the role. On one condition, that you serve as its strategic advisor, so your vision is part of its foundation." A smile, deep and real, broke across his face. It was a partnership, ratified in front of their most skeptical audience. Kwon was reduced to a silent, furious statue. The other board members, after a moment, began to nod, the sound of true progress and good business sense cutting through the scandal they'd anticipated. The meeting adjourned in a surreal blur. In the echoing hallway, away from prying eyes, they stood facing each other. The weight of the performance fell away, leaving only the truth. "You gave up your company," she whispered, awestruck. "I am changing its shape," he corrected gently. "And building something new. With you." He reached out and her hand met his. Their fingers laced together, tight and sure, a promise made visible. Later, in the private stillness of his now former office, they stood before the panoramic window, the city they were about to reshape together sprawling below. He turned to her, drawing her into the circle of his arms. This hug was different from all the others. It was not comfort, not greeting, not shelter from a storm. It was a culmination. It was solid, full of a quiet joy and the profound peace of a journey beginning where it was meant to. Her arms wrapped around him, holding him just as tightly. They stood there, in their silent, enduring embrace, no longer a secret, no longer a crush, but the architects of their own forever. The future was not a question mark, but a blueprint they would draw together.